Welcome to the Clean Power Hour Live. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today, C&I solar PPAs, best practices, and success stories. Check out all of our content at cleanpowerhour.com. Check out the events tab. We have several events this year, so please check out the events tab and subscribe to our YouTube channel. The solar C&I PPA is a well-established financing tool in the industry, but it is also a bit of a mystery. I am very pleased to present an expert panel today with Marc Palmer. He is the CEO and founder of Conductor Solar, and Nick Perugini of Solaris Energy. And we are going to be breaking down what it takes to design, develop, and finance solar PPA projects in the C&I space. Marc is, as I mentioned, the co-founder and CEO of Conductor Solar. He brings extensive experience in the renewable energy project finance and development, with over $1.5 billion raised for clean energy projects. And Nick Perugini brings over a decade of solar energy experience to his role as VP and co-owner of Solaris Energy, based in Colorado. With a focus on non-residential solar and storage, Nick leads project sourcing, analysis, development, and financing for the company. Our panelists are going to make some brief introductory comments. I would encourage our audience to put questions in the Q&A chat, okay? And if you have a comment, you can also put that in the Q&A. We will be curating questions during the duration of the panel discussion and then spending the last 15 minutes of our time this morning answering those questions. And I want to thank Aaron James from Conductor Solar for being in the background today, helping us out with that. With that, I will let you, Marc Palmer, introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody, for joining. This will be a fun discussion. Nick and I have known each other for a couple of years, and same with Tim and I. So we thought it made sense for everybody to get together and just talk PPAs, because everybody has different experiences, perspectives, and it's not easy, but it's not as hard as some people think it will be. So we're going to help try to bridge that gap a little bit. Just a little background on myself. I've been in the industry for about a dozen years. Always with the financing and development side. So really new projects and getting projects built and financed. Spent a lot of time in the utility scale market, and then spent for the last 7 years, I've been in the middle market. We launched Conductor Solar in 2021 as a platform to really help to simplify the financing process for middle market projects. We call it middle market. We focus on C&I and community solar projects. These really are anything as small as 50 kilowatts up to 7, 8, maybe 10 megawatts in size. And we're looking to help parties in this ecosystem find the right partners to work with, transact with them more effectively, and collaborate with all the details that matter. So we won't spend a lot of time on Conductor today. I think we're going to talk about some of the core concepts that we support and focus on. But that's my quick background. Nick, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Marc. And thanks for having me, Tim. Really appreciate it. An honor to be here. Yes, Nick Perugini, Vice President, co-owner, Solaris Energy here. My solar career goes back to about 2008, actually about this time of year, 2008, so 16 years. Now, I had actually cut my teeth on the EPC side of things, originally in kind of sales and origination, and then sales team direction, always more dominantly, I should say, in the non-residential market back then. Did a lot of that customer interaction, setting customer expectations, working with the design and build teams, the engineers, trying to keep happy customers and keep them coming back. A lot of contract work. I think I've built kind of my experience well-rounded around the contract, which is a core piece of the PPA and making it easier. I was also the former board chair of the Colorado Solar and Storage Association. Shameless plug, if you're not a member of your local association, please become one. And those EPC routes, I think, really helped me work with our partners that we have today, whether it be Marc or builders, originators. Solaris Energy falls more in the developer category these days, though, Solaris is a 15-year, 10 years started with the earliest projects. Our founder, Alex Blackmere, who I had actually met when I was on the EPC side of things and built projects for him to fund and finance. We stayed connected over the years, and I hooked up with the Solaris team several years ago, became partner fairly recently, and been enjoying the ride ever since. Solaris's experience is breadth, again, the CNI, mush market, or commercial industrial, or municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, development, finance, owner, operator of those third-party owned systems. And looking forward to this discussion and hopefully giving some tips and tricks to make things a little bit easier for everyone else too. We've taken our lumps.
Before we get into the meat of it, I wanted to ask both of you at a high level, when you're talking to solar installers and developers about third-party finance, what are the basic nuts and bolts of a good project? Because I think that many people struggle to understand when they're in the early stages of developing projects, really what does it take to get a project financed with third party? And I think it's going to save everybody a lot of time when developers and CNI installers can really hone in on, well, these are the guardrails. So if you would, Marc, tell us what it takes to get a good project going.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the nuances later on, but I think at its core, Tim, it's really two fundamental things. One is the customer going to save money and financially benefit from choosing to pursue solar PPA? And that's really important, because if they aren't saving money, then maybe the decision makers will not be, the decision makers in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And whoever steps in will wonder, why am I in this contract and why am I paying more to, use solar power? And so they'll be incentivized to get out of the contract. And that's all that is, the PPA providers, the investors have to hang on to, is, the customer paying their bills. And so they've got to save money. And usually it's a 10% discount off what they're paying today. Ideally more, but at least 10%, and then some reasonable, escalator over time, so that, they should stay under the utility rates. The other one is, will this customer be around for 20 years, 25 years to pay their bills? Again, that's, kind of the same theme as, really, when you put solar on the roof of a school, you only have the school to pay the bills, and you might be able to squeeze a little value out of the project if they stop, wanting the power altogether. But that's a situation nobody wants to deal with. So I think really those are, in my mind, the two fundamental aspects that you have to consider. And then the third is just, how well do you know the market and the utility and the permitting and stuff like that? So, as a developer and EPC, can you just get a project built effectively? A lot of details that matter within that, but I think those are the things that come to my mind. Nick, anything you'd add?
Yeah, a couple of additions, Marc. You hit on one of them there. Credit worthiness of that off-taker or subscriber, who's a counterparty on that PPA. Now, that's not a deal breaker if their credit's moderate, but the question should arise pretty early on of, like, hey, you haven't been around a long time, or you're not a multi-million dollar company. How can you do this? If you thought about a project, that's $500,000 to tens of millions of dollars, what would it look like for that company to get a loan of that scale? The same hoops are going to be necessary to jump through there. One of the ways I like to describe it is, before starting the race, I like to know what the finish line looks like. So underwriting for the investor, that third-party owner, is something that should be kept in mind. A crazy, outlandish project, with experimental technology or a host that has unrealistic expectations, is going to be hard to finance or hard to fund. However, if you have a fairly straightforward rooftop, carport, or some ground mount on the back 40 behind the meter type system, that's a slam dunk. And then the process is very easy. So those are the two minor additions, but you captured it, Mark.
Great, well said. Here is our agenda. We've done the intros obviously already, and we're going to be talking about finding and aligning with your customer, finding and aligning with your financing partner, closing the deal, and then some Q&A. And along the way, I think we will get to hear some case studies of projects, not necessarily by name, but perhaps. And there's nothing like what is actually happening in the world. I'm very fond of this concept. There's ideas and then there's reality. And so that's one of the great things about these two guests is they are in the thick of the solar PPA world on a daily basis and have lots of experience under their belt. Marc, finding and aligning with your customer. What do you mean by your customer? You mean the host of the solar array?
It's going to be a consistent theme in this webinar, Tim, is, what do we mean by this word? And it's all these other words too, possibly. By customer, the user of the power. So if we're thinking about the C&I market, the person who's going to be using the power, paying for that power is who we consider, at least for purposes of this webinar, to be the customer.
Yeah.
Other words might be off-taker. Some people would say end customer. There's probably some other ones, but those are the ones that come to my mind.
Someday our industry will unify our terminology here and acronyms.
I hope so.
And the solar PPA has been around for 20 years or so in the United States now. So it is a maturing financial tool, but most C&I off-takers are completely clueless about solar PPAs unless they're a big corporation with many facilities, like a Walmart or a Target that is operating in multiple markets and has started to solarize their fleet of facilities. And many of these Fortune 500 companies do use a PPA, which I find very interesting. But Marc, tell us what your thoughts are about finding and aligning with your customer.
Tim, I'll hand that over to Nick. I think he's probably a little closer to the customer in the conversations and Solaris's role as a developer on the project. So Nick, I'll hand that over to you to walk through some of those details.
It's been a while since I've been in the field and pounding pavement and dialing for dollars. However, the experience in that is long and true, and I've guided teams lots along the way. Every organization is going to have their, origination group or methodology, marketing, communication, dialing, cold calls, email blasts. The best way to find a customer is for them to find you. A warm lead, of course, always better than a cold one you're trying to sell. I think it's important early on that you're identifying a champion in those organizations who's going to be your go-to and an ally for you to get this potential project moved through the chain of command up to the decision makers. And you definitely need to know who those decision makers are, even if you're not directly communicating with them right off the bat, which is often a challenge in a larger commercial organization. So there's that. There's also RFPs potentially, kind of for origination. Not my favorite, but can be, big, lucrative, and usually healthy projects. You have to be able to solve a problem for them, whether it's, meeting their environmental goals, additional revenue stream from unused roof space. There's lots of angles to take. It's always wise, I think, to do some homework on that organization, read about them, see what articles were published, check out their website, see what they've done in the past, tailor your messaging to something that they're going to listen to. Then from there, and not to be too long-winded, because it's a long process, right? It's usually 3 to 6 months of courting at least for that kind of an entity. You want to set realistic expectations, accuracy in your modeling, whether you use online tools or your own spreadsheets, realistically looking at what is the solar going to do for them? How much can it save? And I'll abbreviate to close on this piece would be, I really think it's the right wise thing to do is lead with financing. Sometimes you'll just scare away a potential customer by saying, "Oh, we can do this beautiful project, and it's only, $5 million," and that's it. The sticker shock is gonna glaze their eyes over, and they're not gonna move forward. But if you say, "Hey, we can sell you the exact same product you're buying from the utility at a lesser rate," wouldn't you want to look at that? No,
Nick, how do you like? I feel like with that phrasing, something I've heard before as a customer, wow, so no money down, I save money on day one. On if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. So in terms of, making sure they understand that it is that simple at its concept, but there's, some details behind it. Mainly, I guess, like what are some of the challenges what makes that not too good to be true for the end customer, things for everybody to consider, questions, and kind of arm them on some of the questions like term length or, things like that.
It's not effort free on the customer's part, right? They're going to have to provide 12 months of electric bills, accuracy on in that. What's the condition of their roof? Do they have the warranty? You'd be surprised how many building owners have no idea what warranty is on their roof. That needs to be known. They're going to need to allow people to peek into their industry and poke around in their electrical room and give tours on the roof, expose their finances, so NDAs are in order. They have to be a willing participant in this. But then it does sound too good to be true, but it's not. It's often true. Now, that is market specific, right? If you have a region where there's a very low energy kilowatt hour rate, it may be hard for a PPA to beat that rate on its face. And then sometimes there's other creative methods, a small prepayment, basically to buy down that starting rate. But there's a lot of levers we can pull to kind of balance and hopefully provide something that everybody likes.
Yeah, I would argue that there are two major barriers to solar PPAs. One is the price of power. Here in the Midwest, for example, we have very cheap power, especially for large off-takers. It could be they're paying 3, 4, 5, 6 cents. And that's why you need good state legislation and incentives like renewable energy credits, right? That brings down the price of the solar energy and allows developers and financiers to offer a competitive solar PPA. And in general, a shorter payback period. The second is just outright barriers. There are many states where third-party PPAs are not explicitly allowed. Indiana, next door here to Illinois, is one of those places. I think Wisconsin, you can't do a PPA. Now, there are some workarounds in some places. And, of course, where there's a workaround, things are happening. It's just not called a PPA. But how would you guys characterize the U.S. now in terms of, how many states can you reasonably do a good solar PPA in?
I would say most, but we still have to dive in almost always.
More than 30?
PPA or PPA like?
Yeah, PPA or PPA like. Oftentimes, Tim, we use a solar services agreement, which really is functionally the same as a power purchase agreement. The lawyers had at it, made sure that it would be more acceptable in those regions where PPAs aren't maybe explicitly allowed or disallowed. But going back to what I said earlier, if you look at that finish line, is a financier, a third-party owner, investor, and a tax equity investor especially, are they going to find that there's a risk there, or are they going to be comfortable with that?
Is there more to say about a solar services agreement? Because that expression is new to me. So what exactly is that, and how does that compare to a power purchase agreement?
In some places, either some utilities or some jurisdictions where a power purchase agreement itself is not allowed, it's a little bit of, kind of legalese wrangling. And it has to be vetted. Lawyers are very important in these kind of things. It has to be vetted so that finance will find that that's an acceptable.
So it's more analogous to a lease then?
No, I would say it's more analogous to a power purchase agreement. It's
I
very
think it's
functionally
it's kind of a hybrid, right, Nick? It's like, so you've got two key bodies that people are worried about. You've got the utilities, and are they going to claim that you're acting, owning the solar system, the owner is acting like a utility? And then you also have the IRS and who owns the system for tax purposes and gets the tax credit and depreciation and those benefits. And so I always think about, energy services agreement and solar services agreement to be pretty comparable, to kind of be both of, like, the solar services agreement is often, to the utility, it looks and feels like a lease. To the IRS, it looks and feels a little bit more like a PPA.
There you go.
And so it's a bit of a, it's a slick way to get solar built through this structure in some states, and in some places it's less risky than others.
Correct.
Like I think in Arizona there's a specific call out that's permitted for like nonprofits in I think APS territory. Anyways, there's some templates, but then there's other states where those templates may not be public. They're done, but they're not as widely talked about for just trying not to make a big splash.
And the lesson there is, if you are getting a new lead or a customer in a market that you haven't worked in before, make sure that this works. And before, getting the customer excited about something only to say, no, we can't do that. And getting in touch with someone like Marc or myself is going to be able to answer that question for you.
Okay. I'm going to put this slide on screen. PPAs unlock more projects. In theory, PPAs unlock more projects, but it always I find it always a little confounding what types of customers are going to want to go down that path. Struggling with the controls there a little bit. PPAs unlock more solar projects. So, but paint us a picture. I'm not sure if this is for you, Marc, or for you, Nick, but at face value, what is the value proposition here, and especially think about or explain, if you would, like what is the profile that you're looking for in a customer?
Yeah, sure. I'll take it. I think one of the things to start with is, do they have the cash? And APCs see this all the time. Does the customer have the cash to buy this system, or do they have funding mechanisms to get their own loans to afford the system? They may have the capital resources one way or the other, but they may have more important things that they feel they want to use that money for. Upgrades to their system, new equipment, new hires, expansions, a new location, so many things in a business that energy is a lot of the times a secondary consideration for business and building owners. They figure they just got to pay their electric bill. That's just part of doing business. So a PPA can kind of swoop in and say, hey, we don't need to attack your capital budgets. You can leave those all as is. We can save you on your operational expense year over year. You get a lot of claims to the solar green benefits, some of the bragging rights, if you like. But when it comes down to it, you save money. I like to say that sometimes it's one kind of green that gets the original interest, but it's a different kind of green that seals the deal. One other thing, if I could add there, another important feature is the customer's ability to use tax benefits. The investment tax credit, the ITC, is sizable, especially if you get adders from the Inflation Reduction Act. So now you could get 40, 50% plus ITC. That could be millions of dollars of tax credits. That customer may not be able to monetize those in a short time frame. Power purchase agreement solves that too, puts that money to work immediately through tax equity partner, giving that customer a more attractive rate.
Since you brought this up, we have a question from the audience. Can you speak to PPA users' tax considerations at the end of the year? Would using a lease sometimes be more favorable in terms of tax preparation for the business?
I always like to say I'm not a tax advisor. Please consult your tax attorney. The typical disclaimer there. In a PPA, basically that would increase a business's profit at their year end when they're putting all their numbers together, all things being equal, because they spent less on the expense of electricity. Now, there are certain other payments, like in the loan, where they could write off, or in lease payments that may vary depending on their circumstance, how much they could write off as a loss or an expense too. The impacts should be pretty similar.
Yeah, and they're operating expenses.
Right, they're operating expenses.
Tim, I'll I just want to expand a little bit on what Nick was talking about in terms of, the PPAs unlock more projects. So, they, people who can't afford or don't want to spend the money or prioritize or can't use the tax, whatever the reason, to choose to buy and own their own solar. They don't want to operate it and maintain it, whatever. They have an option to still choose to go solar and save money. And so that's huge. I think it really unlocks more projects, especially as you get to bigger projects, because it's just a bigger, like solar's it's not cheap. Like it's a meaningful investment, no matter how big the organization is. Even if it's a 100 kW, usually the solar system sizing is pretty comparable to the underlying entity's sizing. A church doesn't need a 2 megawatt system. They usually need a 50 kW, 150 kW system. But that's still that's a $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 expense, which is still significant for an organization of that size. So I think as you get bigger and bigger, especially to these megawatt, 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt systems, it's just, it's a really heavy expense for these organizations to spend. So I think that's really important, and just something to recognize as, being able to offer and sell a PPA becomes more and more, I think, relevant and applicable as you get to larger system sizes, because it's just that much heavier of an investment. And then the other thing I'll mention is, in the C&I market, about 75% of the dollars that are going to build solar projects in this market are going towards PPA projects. So it's not 75% of the numbers. So, for every 100 projects built, I don't know the number of projects that are, doing a PPA versus not, but the total dollar volume is, 75% of those dollars spent across those 100 projects. So it's a huge portion of the market. In the large projects, obviously, it's landed that way, of course, but just wanted to share some of those data points.
Yeah, I would caution the EPCs listening here about knowing truly what type of financing a customer is going to prefer. Even if they have a very healthy balance sheet and a profitable business, they may defer to third-party ownership for a whole variety of other reasons. And so, in my opinion, you really have to put all the cards on the table and give your customer the options available to them: cash purchase, PPA, lease, or some of these lesser known varieties. But those are the three big ones, right? They buy the system outright and then take care of it themselves, and that's a non-trivial thing. For most companies, they go, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to own a power plant, and that's the surprising thing about some of these Fortune 500 companies that are often buying PPAs. Walmart is a well-known one. Target is another, and they're solarizing huge portions of their fleets now across the country via third-party ownership. And so you need guys like Nick and Marc to make those deals happen. Is there anything about the sophistication of a customer that you want to speak to? Because a PPA agreement is a little intimidating in my mind. So what do you guys think about that?
I'll start there, Marc. Yeah, thanks, Tim, for that. To reflect on what you just said, and then I'll move to that, was every customer likes choices. Customer options is good. So giving, that customer that choice of that cash purchase, potentially a loan, a PPA, I think is just a must do. The complexity of a PPA itself, yeah, I'm used to it, so it doesn't seem that complex to me. It seems pretty simple and straightforward. But, I think thankfully years back, SEIA introduced, their standard form of power purchase agreement. It's been widely accepted and used across the country, maybe slightly modified by many, plugged some holes as some laws changed over the years. But it basically lays out, the obligations of both parties exactly with this slide too. The system owner is responsible for paying for design and engineering, the construction of the system, the operations of the system, and then insuring the system, all taxes and stuff on the system, both tax benefits and any taxes to be paid. And the customer's obligation is pretty simple in that they have to allow access and use of that piece of property or rooftop where the solar sits, and then they need to pay their invoices on time. They have the option to buy out the system, typically after year 6. And it's spelled out. It's not too heavy of a lift. Surprisingly, over the 120 some odd sites that we have operational, most parties got through the PPA reasonably well. Did they bring in a lawyer? Most did. But it was fairly understandable terminology. So it doesn't have to be rocket science, and it's not meant to be onerous. But all long-term commercial contracts require some legalese and formatting.
Sure.
No different than a loan agreement. Someone buys a house or a car, and honestly, a lot of the provisions are very much the same.
Yeah, a lot of it is, here are the main deal points.
Yep.
I'll charge you this, you'll pay that, and here's when I'll charge you, and here's when you'll pay it. And then it's everything else is like, and here's all the other stuff that might go wrong, and we just want to get ahead of, how we'll deal with it. What if you ask me to remove it from your roof? Like, that's going to cost us money. You need to help make sure we pay that, because we can't. That's not a trivial cost. So it's a lot of those different circumstances that are in there as well. Again, a lot of these types of financing are just legal contracts.
And most important, I think, is, of course, there's a legal contract that kind of defines the relationship, but having that trust and rapport with your customer, with your builder, and that confidence that the parties are working together. This is a team effort. No one party can get this done by themselves. It's often a 3 or 4-way collaboration. Everybody has to be involved in that and understand what their expectations are. And then only if things go catastrophically wrong do you go to the, conflict resolution provisions within your contract. Hopefully you never have to go there.
So the long and short of this is that, yes, your customer is going to have to either have in-house counsel or a third party review the contract, but totally doable. And most commercial customers are doing some level of, contracting to begin with. This is just a different variety. We have a question about project size, and this is a very important topic. And every financier has their own profile in terms of size of project, minimum threshold. What do you gentlemen say about project size, and how should EPCs and developers think about this? Because, the commercial solar project could be 50 to 100 kW, or it could be 500 kW to 5 megawatts. And those are very different animals and different project profiles, really. So what do you guys say about project size?
Largely, people are usually surprised that almost any size is doable for the PPA. The importance is aligning with the right financing partner for that. And there are some details that matter, but I think sticking to the core of, is the customer going to save money, and are they going to be around to pay their bills for the length of the contract? And I think with those ideas in mind, and obviously, are they going to save money is not an easy answer for a lot of developers and EPCs, because they don't know the black box that says what the PPA rate will be. We can help them with that. Nick and I both have a lot of experience in terms of different sizes and how things will vary based on location and some of the details around a solar project that affect economics, like the production. Is it just a project in Maine or is it a project in New Mexico? These things all matter, but they come together in a really nice and kind of organized way to result in projects that can get ultimately funded and built. So we've supported projects as low as I think 20 kW, and as high as I think 30 megawatts is the largest one that we've spent time on. Most of them are in between, and most projects we see are typically in the couple hundred kW range to couple megawatt range, especially for the C&I behind the meter. But that's the way I think about it. It's just really finding the right partner who is interested in that project and able to manage that project size and that customer relationship and still offer savings.
Yeah.
I'll only add that to me, I usually answer the size question with more of, does it pencil? Does the project pencil? And that for all parties, can the EPC get their ask covered for what it costs to build it? Will that customer save money? And then will the investor make their returns back in time? I think we usually end up, as a rule of thumb, 150 to 200 kilowatts and above, only because there are certain fixed costs that overburden a very small project. That said, our earliest projects in 2002, 2008, 2009 were 10 or 20 kilowatts when 1603 grant was big. And those have actually reverted back to those hosts, those customers, and they now own those. So it varies. We'll look at almost anything at least once.
I think there's a couple other aspects of projects at face value here that we should touch on before getting into more depth on the finance partner side of this equation. Thank you, John Brost, for your question about the size of projects. John is working in Minnesota, his portfolio of church projects, and churches are interesting because they're nonprofits. Now they can use the ITC, but historically, nonprofits would go PPA, right? Because they can't use the ITC tax benefits historically. Now that's changing somewhat. They also tend not to be cash rich, and so the $0 down phenomenon is very attractive to nonprofits. But when you think, Mark, of a portfolio of church projects in Minnesota, what is your gut reaction? Is that going to be interesting to financiers, do you think?
Yeah, the right financiers who are familiar with funding church projects, and they understand that most houses of worship and religious organizations, fundraising is a natural part of their life cycle, and they may not have a profitable operations, but they always seem to figure it out. So you look at things of like, how long have they been around? And that's obviously a key testament. So if they've been around for 50, 60 years, like that's a pretty strong story just in and of itself, regardless of what their financials look like. So in Minnesota and a portfolio of church deals, yeah, absolutely. I think that's, something that, again, is it going to save the churches money? And if the answer is yes, then, it's all about finding the right partner who wants to own those projects. You don't want to work with somebody that doesn't want to own those projects, and it's a stretch and it's pulling teeth and like this is outside of their box, but they're going to try to make it work. Like it's going to be a bad experience usually because that's just not their sweet spot. And so I think those details matter. But in short, yes, I think that should be an attractive, grouping of projects.
And then we have several questions about rates, meaning the rate that a customer is paying for power. Ahmed in Texas asked, do we have a threshold rate to determine if the power purchase agreement will be viable for a customer if they pay more than 7 cents a kWh? And I don't think that you can give a pat answer to that question, but let's talk about this phenomenon of here's what a customer pays and how do you arrive at a PPA rate? And honestly, until you really crunch the numbers, Ahmed, you're not going to be able to know. And so that's where a Conductor Solar or a Solaris comes in, I think, where you put your project into the platform, so to speak, give them many details on where it is, what's the size, what's the kWh per kWp, et cetera, et cetera. But what do you guys say about this in terms of what customers are paying? Is that even that important on the front end, unless you really have dialed in a market?
It is important, Tim, and you hit it right. We have to run the models, and I wish there was a perfect or easy rule of thumb. There really isn't. The variables need to be known. How much does that system cost? How much energy is it going to produce? What other ancillary costs, property tax, insurance rates, everything else that goes into that. So it's to make it pencil. And I think Marc will say this, that service is free through Conductor. And we can do similar, for projects maybe that aren't mature enough for a platform like Conductor. We can look at those, and it's a free analysis. So, and we can turn them around usually within 2 business days is our goal. So it shouldn't be a painful lift, I would hope. From when I started in solar and I wanted PPA quotes, it was like 3 weeks. So, that stuff is fairly mechanized these days. At least that's what we've done, to plug in the primary inputs to get a result. Now, that said, you mentioned earlier, Tim, some states in the Midwest, 4.5 cent energy. We're all going to be hard pressed to hit 4.5 cents. But there's creative minds that will work on it too. How else can we do it with some prepayment, or what kind of adder is that potential? Does it have an energy community adder under the IRA? Or hopefully soon enough, we'll have domestic content adders with confidence. So there's other variables that can still help push that in the right territory, even before you get into potential demand savings.
Yeah, I'll add there, Nick. I think there's not a broad rule of thumb because so many of those details matter, but there's typically a rule of thumb in each area, right?
Sure,
So,
yeah.
In Colorado, your general rules of thumb, same with California, same with Ohio. And just to expand on what Nick mentioned, thanks, Nick, on the Conductor Solar platform, one of our cool positions in the market is that we see pricing for hundreds of solar projects from the investors who want those projects, whether it's a 50 kW project or a 5 megawatt project and everything in between. And so what we've done is we make the user put in the inputs that are relevant to pricing and valuing a solar project. And then we take all of that data that we see live in the market on live transactions and provide that back in a PPA range for EPCs and developers to get a rough sense. It's not meant to be quotable. You can use it. People use it in different ways, but it's a range that we almost always see accurate in the market in terms of where investors will ultimately be able to fund and support, given the project economics and details that were provided.
Let's segue to finding and aligning with your finance partner. I think we have about 10 minutes left. We've answered, we've gotten some good questions, and we will continue to answer questions. But this is a big part of the PPA world is finding the right partner, not only for your company as the EPC or the developer, but for your customer. And every project is different. And eventually you will learn as you develop projects and get back information about what PPA can be provided in what geography with what type of opportunity, so to speak, right? The more bankable it is, the lower the PPA. The better the incentives, the lower the PPA rate. And you're always driving. Everyone wants to offer a lower PPA rate because that's going to generate more ROI for the customer. So what do you guys have to say, though, about finding a financing partner? And I'll put up this paradigm slide that you have.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to that, Tim. I think, before jumping in, when you find the right financing partner, this whole concept of PPAs becomes so much easier.
Mhm.
And it's really important to find the right partner. And so we think this is the most important piece. Yeah, there's a ton of details that go into getting this PPA financed. Project finance is not a simple concept, but when you find the right partner, it all matters. And here are things that we see that are relevant for finding the right partner. So what state and geography are you in? What's your project size? We've talked about that a lot already, so I won't go into that further, but there's different partners or investors who want to fund a project that's 50 kilowatts, who aren't a good fit for maybe a 2 megawatt project, and vice versa. A lot of investors have their sweet spot of what projects excite them and get them out of bed and get them excited when they get that one done. They're happy about it. They don't feel like they're slogging through it all because it's really a targeted project for them. And who's the customer type? Is it a for-profit investment grade entity? That's oftentimes that's kind of everybody. Everybody would usually do a for-profit investment grade entity, but not everybody will do an unrated entity. A medium-sized business, local business, or a not-for-profit or NGO. And so the customer type matters. And then you look at some other qualitative things like what's your experience level coming into this as the developer, because that matters. And are you used to only selling cash deals? Did you grow from the residential world? Are you coming from the utility scale world? Have you done community solar projects or not? Like, all these things can help influence of who the right partner is to actually work on this project, because we've had a fun post on like solar dialects, and everybody talks a different language of solar, and that causes a lot of miscommunications unintentionally, because party A is assuming one thing, party B is assuming another thing, and they don't even know to ask that and confirm that they're assuming different things. And then the last piece is just understanding the financing partners as they evolve over time. They change. And so I think one of the things in that slide, Tim, is today, Tuesday. It seems really arbitrary to a lot of people. It just seems like the financing partner didn't want to work on this deal. And maybe they didn't, and it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're full, they're really busy right now, and this project doesn't kind of make it in their queue to be attractive for them. Maybe they're looking to do a different type of project than they had in the past. Maybe they're focusing on a different geography, and just because they were excited about that project 6 months ago or a year ago doesn't mean that's going to be true today. So those are all kind of the main concepts that I think about when thinking about who the right financing partner would be for a project and a developer or EPC.
I think
Can I add something, Tim?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll keep it brief because I know we're getting down to the end here. Think of like the business empathy of this. If you were the investor, if you had the money and you were to put up hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars towards something, what would you want to see in a level of risk and or return? If it seems like something's a little crazy or outlandish, then the investor community is probably going to feel the same way. However, if, like Mark mentioned, if it's a Fortune 500 publicly traded and healthy company, that's a slam dunk. Now, there are ways to strategize and get that, moderate credit level entity passed, and or organizations of faith, as mentioned earlier. If you can group up a handful of small ones in a similar geography or utility, there's creative ways. You still got to talk to someone in the finance world that's going to help you navigate that properly.
Yeah, one other thought I had that I don't want to leave out is, has the financing provider executed on something like this in the past? Like, you don't want to get to the finish line and find out they don't really know what they're doing. They don't have the right capital sources. They can't fund the project. That's obviously a disaster scenario for everybody involved, but especially for the customer and the developer and EPC with the relationship. So understanding where the risks are, and do they have experience in a similar type of project, maybe not in that state or that utility zone, but something similar. And if not, then why should they, why can they get to the finish line here smoothly? That's part of the reason why we don't work with new financing partners into the market. We're not trying to bring new people into the market who've never done it before. We're trying to work with parties who know how to execute, and maybe they're trying to do something a little bit different, but ultimately they've got those pieces figured out, and they're looking to be a good, reliable partner.
We're going to move on in a sec to closing the deal, but in my experience, you'll find as an EPC looking for a PPA partner that there are a couple just simple things. Ease of use, like can you get things done in an effective manner, in a timely manner? Competitive rates. Are you getting a PPA out on the projects that you're working on that is going to save your customer money and get traction? Not all financiers are going to have the same PPA rate. There will be a spectrum of rates because there's all kinds of nuances to what the investors are looking for. And I would say just those are two big things: ease of use and the rate that you're getting out of the deal. But let's talk about closing the deal, and then we'll answer a few other questions from our audience. When you guys think about you're in the, where the stars are aligning, you've got a good project, you've got a good off-taker, and you want to do the deal, what does it take to close a PPA?
I like to use kind of a stepped sale, a simple engagement letter which lays out everything known to date, sometimes a term sheet, a little more complex, get that signed by, and this is a little bit not in the mainstream, but signed by the three parties, the builder slash developer, the finance company, and that host off taker. We're agreeing to, if these parameters remain the same, this is a deal we're going to do. That's fairly benign and easy to sign, and then move to the legalese of the contracts, and dial in the details. Truly, development lives up to its name, as it starts as a fuzzy picture and it gets clearer and clearer and clearer.
Yeah, often some things I'll add. I think outlining the high level expectations is upfront is really helpful. It may seem like kind of an annoyance because you just want to get moving on like the closing the deal and not signing some non-binding term sheet or LOI, but really that's both parties providing a commitment to focus on the high level things and agree that for some amount of time they're going to work together to try to get this closed in good faith. So then you get to timing. Oftentimes it can take 6 to 10 weeks to get to a closing, just because there's a lot of details that matter. There's a lot of documentation. It's not always controversial, but there's a lot of the details there. And I think thinking about the expectations and thinking about that term sheet or LOI, that's where we see a lot of things fall apart, especially when people come at these financings from different backgrounds, is understanding who's going to do what when, who's going to pay for what when, and who's going to be at risk when. And so thinking about ultimately most financing providers on the PPA side of the world, they'll start funding the project when it gets to NTP, and they want it to be properly de-risked. And so what does that mean? What does NTP mean? Like, what do you need to have to get there? And it differs based on a rooftop project or a ground mount project. And some financing providers care more about other things than some other ones. And so, for example, on a ground mount project, many will require a phase one environmental site assessment. And that's oftentimes because they have some sort of bank or institutional level financing, or they've been burned by it in the past, and they want to make sure there aren't any environmental concerns when you start constructing the project. Not everybody will require that, though. So understanding that up front makes sense. And most times when customers have paid cash out of pocket for projects, they don't feel the need for an environmental site assessment. So a lot of EPCs don't expect that, but that can be $6,000 that needs to be spent by the EPC before there's any promise of funding coming from the other side, because then a PPA investor doesn't want to put money out the door with that risk, outstanding. So there's a number of those, and I think just aligning on, equipment and, roles and responsibilities and funding, that causes a lot of friction. The other ones I'll flag as being kind of threshold items are making sure that the PPA financing partner is good with the customer credit. We've talked a lot about, will they be around to pay their bills for 20 years? So get them to figure that out sooner rather than later, because it's binary. It's yes or no. And if it's, and maybe it'll change price, but usually it works or it doesn't. And then the other one is production estimates. So, that for EPCs, I think it's a neat way for working with somebody who has lived with these projects for years and has maybe hundreds of them that they own and operate. And they really have a good sense of what a system is going to produce for the long term, when it's going to go down, like on kind of law of averages perspective. And so they care a lot about what the estimates are, because that's a key value driver for, ultimately the value of this project. And so there's always a healthy tension in understanding what the production estimates are that should be backed by science and experience. But that's another piece that can really erode a project value. Or, I remember we saw one project get to the finish line and that issue came up, and it's like, we think production is going to be about 7 or 8% lower, which is like a 7 or 8% dip in the value. And like, that was a deal killer. It was not fun for anybody. So anyways, just some thoughts on.
I want to get to a couple other questions before we wrap up here. We're almost to the top of the hour. One is battery storage. Increasingly, battery storage is important to the solar industry. There are markets like California, Illinois, Massachusetts, where there are robust incentives for storage. And in California, it's kind of a must-have now that they've integrated NEM 3.0, which greatly reduces the value of solar. But what kind of experience do you have? And are you financing solar and storage PPAs these days?
Quick answer, yes, but it's just getting started for us. The first storage projects are in development or contracts now. In short, it's an add-on to the PPA with a simple capacity charge. It would probably take a whole nother hour to go through all the kind of nuances of that, Tim. But customer can use that storage in a method that's maximum benefit to them. Demand savings, maybe some resiliency, potentially ancillary services income, and they just pay for a simple capacity charge for having the right to use that battery, in addition to an energy rate. That's what we're doing, at least.
Yeah, we're seeing some behind the meter, solar plus storage. It's just still, there's not a tried and true template of like what the obligations are by whom, in terms of uptime and availability, and who's going to make sure the controls actually dispatch the battery when it's supposed to provide the value that it's supposed to. And so the industry is still figuring that out. But we're starting to see more in California, in particular for behind the meter projects.
I would encourage our viewers and listeners to check out my interview with David Braun, which dropped this week with Intelligent Generation. We do a deep dive into the value stack of battery storage. It's highly variable by market, so you really have to know your market and be working with a trusted partner on the battery software as a service side of things, and then obviously finding an appropriate financier. We're going to have to wrap up, gentlemen. How can our audience find you? Why don't we start with you, Nick?
Easy to hit our website, solarisenergy.com. That's spelled solarisenergy.com. They can reach me through there very easily, or nick.perugini@solarisenergy.com. Thanks, Tim. Been great being here.
Thank you. And Marc Palmer, how can our audience find you, Marc?
Sure. So conductor.solar is our website. And you can reach me at Marc, M-A-R-C, at conductor.solar for email.
I would encourage the audience to reach out to me. If you're looking for a PPA vendor, I can connect you with these two guys as well. You can contact me on LinkedIn or via the website, cleanpowerhour.com. Check out all of our content there. Give us a rating and a review on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I want to thank Marc and Nick for joining us today. This is wonderful content for my audience. And with that, I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Thank you so much, gentlemen.